the best applause that I ever got as First Minister was usually at events that were running about an hour and a half behind schedule, and I spoke very, very briefly. So I shall do that here this afternoon, as I'm sure in particular you want to hear Professor Giddens and move on to the panel session. I just want to say very briefly, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I think the ICD performs a really important function in bringing together particularly, I was going to say young people, certainly younger than me, bringing them together from around the world to talk about vital issues in this interdependent world. My passions are in development and in post-conflict reconstruction and peace building. But also I hope that I can bring over the next 3 days my experience in peaceful constitutional change, which we did do in Scotland. After 300 years of not having our own parliament, we created a parliament largely by consensus that has worked in practice. But also in an understanding of identity politics. I think one of the reasons that all of these issues are complex, complicated and difficult are that people have strong identities. I agree entirely with the previous speaker that there are big regional blocs, not emerging, but getting themselves organised, sometimes continental, sometimes within continents around the world. And I think that that model, which perhaps here in Europe was the first of a constitutional nature, that model is going to become a very dominant model over the next 2 decades across the world. But I think within that, if politicians, decision makers, diplomats forget that people have strong identities, national identities, historic identities, regional identities, then those big regional blocs fall out of step with the people, as the European Union has done from time to time in its history. So I hope that in all of this we can have an understanding that people have strong identities, which they're willing to share, decision-making, which they're willing to share, but those identities need to be recognised. And I would just make a plea, I think, for, well, I mean, I think perhaps in previous conferences organised by ICD, my contributions have sometimes been characterised by their bluntness, and that has helped provoke discussion. I also would make a plea for thinking about the complexities that decision makers find themselves having to deal with. In peace building, for example, how do we get more urgency into post-conflict reconstruction and peace building at the same time as sustaining and promoting national ownership of peace building? Because the two can be very incompatible. National ownership, nationally run, nationally led peace building operations and actions can be very, very slow. And those of us who look from afar at the plight of people who suffer from conflict want to see, I think rightly, more urgency. And how do we match those two objectives, those two important principles? In globalisation, how do we ensure people have the benefits of globalisation but are not exploited? How do we ensure that globalisation opens up the world's markets and trade in a fairer way rather than exploits people in a way which extends the gaps in our world? And in reconciliation, having, as I said, been part of peaceful constitutional change in Scotland, but also observed and played some part behind the scenes in the changes that have taken place in Northern Ireland, there is clearly, in my view, a real dilemma between reconciliation, acceptance that people will have done things in the past for which they may need to be forgiven, and the need to hold people accountable for violence and for conflict that has taken place either in the present or the past. And how do we marry those two? Admirable objectives, forgiveness on one side for the purpose of reconciliation and progress, but on the other side, the need to hold people accountable. And where do you draw the line? Which I think was part of the dilemma that the President was trying to deal with here earlier when he was answering a question about Bashir and the ICC. And all of this, can I say that I approach this in a positive way? One of the reasons I enjoy these conferences is that they look to the future. They learn from the past, but they're not dominated by it. I think the world is changing around us and changing in the right way. If you had said 3 years ago that there would be a G20 more dominant perhaps now than the G8 in its discussions, certainly more listened to. If we had said that the American administration, for all its faults and for all the difficulties that it might face, given the elections earlier this week, American administration would be more multilateral than unilateral in its approach to international politics, which I think the American president and his administration currently are. And if we had said that these strong regional bodies that were mentioned just a minute ago, particularly the African Union, would be taking the kind of approach to conflict resolution and progress that they are taking today, rather than the one that was taken in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s and the 60s by its predecessor organisation, then I don't think we would have believed that that was possible. Today it is happening around us, and we might face huge challenges of climate change, international security, and the collapse of international finance, partly as a result of globalisation, but we also face, in the global way that many are dealing with these problems, real hope for the future, and that's where I'm coming from in all of our discussions. Look forward to them.